Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are at our time, so welcome. Hope you had a good lunch. Hope you're having a good day. I'm going to open with prayer, then I'll make an announcement or so, and then welcome our speaker for this seminar this afternoon. So please pray with me. Thank you, O God, for feeding us in body, and now again also in mind and in spirit. We pray, O Lord, that you will be blowing through this entire symposium by your Holy Spirit, generating new friendships, new insights, fresh ideas, energizing things that will, for some people who have come here kind of tired, maybe it'll feel like a jump start for their ministry and their role in it. And we pray that that will be true here, too, as we think about preaching from a part of your word. Be with Dr. Edwards. Bless him and bless each of us as we listen and as we ask questions and converse. We pray it through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So just a couple notes. There is going to be a reception for a group right out here afterwards. So very shortly, a couple of signs will be stuck inside the door there to encourage you to exit out that way so you don't walk into that reception. So when we're finished around 3:30, you can kind of head out that way. That would be helpful. And basically, so Dr. Edwards said that he will definitely leave some time for questions at the end, but there may be some in between too. And when there are some, that I'll bring the microphone around to anybody with a question so that it gets also on the recording. So we, as you might guess, we on the symposium planning team and at the Worship Institute, we work on this about 352 days a year. We'll give ourselves a couple days next week, and then we'll be on to Symposium 2021. And so we're thinking about themes, and it was early last year that was actually Dennis Edwards' commentary in the Zondervan commentary series on 1 Peter. That was a solid, good commentary, and it gave us the idea to use 1 Peter as our 5 anchoring texts for the 5 public worship services at this symposium. So we're very, very grateful for Dr. Edwards for that inspiration for us. He is an associate professor of New Testament at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. He wrote that commentary on 1 Peter. And as you can see in the program book, he has another book that's coming out, What is the Bible and How Do We Understand It? So we're very, very happy to have him here this afternoon to help us think about preaching 1 Peter. Please welcome Dennis Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, it really is a privilege, pleasure to be with you. I think I have the switch on. Can you hear me okay? So they say you shouldn't start with an apology, but I'm apologizing because, when I made the PowerPoint, I didn't realize how big the room would be. The print's pretty small, so I'll be talking through it. If you want the slides, my email address is here, dredwards@northpark.edu, it's there too, but you probably can't see it. And I'm happy to send them to you. So all you have to say is, could you send me the slides? And I'll send them to you. I'm just learning this, that the commentary helped to prompt the topic for the year. I'm really honored. I had no idea. I'm sort of flabbergasted. But I will show you that's what it looks like. This Story of God series is pretty good if you want it. Some of you might remember, if you've been using user-friendly commentaries for a while, the NIV application commentary. Remember that, the NIVAC? Some of you might remember it. It's still around. It's Zondervan right up the road. But I think the Story of God, they wanted to maybe start to replace it, because when the NIV got updated in 2011, was around the time I think they brainstormed about doing this series. So Scott McKnight, who was one of my professors when I was at Trinity Seminary, is the general editor. Then I worked alongside him for a year at Northern Seminary, and now I'm at North Park. But anyway, that's what it looks like. It's a good series. What I'm hoping during today is we'll talk about some of the important things related to the book. We'll get into some aspects of the book. We've got some good time together. Hopefully, if it's okay with you, we'll do a little work in groups. And But, you know, I'm all for doing what you feel comfortable doing, but I'm going to ask if you're willing to do that. And as I said, I feel really badly about the small print, so I will explain what's on the slides. And, I mean, you could all huddle up real close, but that's, again, you don't have to sit where I ask you to sit. So it was like in church. I was in a workshop in the panel discussion earlier before lunch, and I said how, for me, I've always been in churches where people are trying really hard to get everybody to sit up front. And I thought, I don't care what people said. I'm just happy they're here. So it was not, to me, it's like, you can sit anywhere you want. You can stand, you can lean against the wall, doesn't matter. So you heard a little bit about me. I'll just say a little bit more because it's not in the bio, and hopefully it'll help you to know me better and be comfortable and gracious. I grew up in New York City. Don't hold it against me. I really am a proud New Yorker. And I went to college upstate New York. I went to Cornell. I got a degree in chemical engineering, but I didn't work much as a chemical engineer, and I taught math and chemistry for years, sometimes while doing ministry too. But I eventually went to Trinity Seminary, as I mentioned, where I met Scott McKnight, and I planted a church in Brooklyn, New York. It was in the late 80s, and we were there around the same time that Redeemer was getting started in Manhattan. I remember talking to Tim Keller. It's funny because when we met through some mutual friends, and he said, you know, when people start churches, they always go to like the book of Ephesians, do a Bible study in the book of Ephesians to talk about what the church should be like. He said you should go through the gospel and see what Jesus is like. And I felt all sheepish because we were doing a Bible study in Ephesians to see what the church would be like. So I think that's why Redeemer blew up and New Community didn't. So I don't think that's the main reason, but I think that's one of the reasons. I don't like to make it seem like we're in competition in any way. But being a native New Yorker, I knew, you know, uptown, you get the hipsters and the transplants and the people who are figuring themselves out and have some means. And we were in Brooklyn and with people with some really tough life situations and no money. And our denomination wasn't big into church planting, so I realized that I was just on my own, so I had to keep teaching school and such, and it turned out to be quite difficult. I won't tell you my whole life story, but it relates to 1 Peter in some ways, and I do share some of the story in the book. But then we moved to D.C., and I worked at an established church on Capitol Hill and learned some tough lessons about being an African-American pastor in a almost all-white church, and that was an interesting 6 years, and that was around the time I did my doctorate in New Testament at the Catholic University of America. If you are familiar with any New Testament scholars, you may have heard the name Joseph Fitzmyer. He was one of my main directors there, and passed away just a few years ago at 96, but a giant of New Testament, and I was really grateful to be able to study with him. And then I planted a church in D.C., in southeast D.C., called Peace Fellowship, which is still going on, doing well. And then after about 17 years in D.C., where my wife and I raised our kids, we took a chance to a church that said they wanted our help in Minneapolis. And so we went to Minneapolis 6 years. Oh, man, those winters. But 6 years, and I served the Sanctuary Covenant Church. But I really came to appreciate the Evangelical Covenant Church. I transferred my credential. I had been ordained in the Mennonite Church, and transferred my credential to the ECC. And then eventually now I teach full-time, teach New Testament full-time. I have been an adjunct professor for a lot of years, but I've been full-time for the last couple of years. Anyway, so that's a quick story. But as I think about getting into 1 Peter, I'm going to share just another little piece of my life. When I moved to D.C., I got acquainted with my great-aunt, Flossie Johnson, my mother's aunt, my grandmother's youngest sister. My grandmother is close to the oldest of her siblings, and there were 11 of them, and they always referred to Aunt Flossie as just baby sister, but she was next to the youngest, but the youngest woman. My mother was born to Josie. Okay, so you got my grandmother, Flossie, her younger sister, my mother, who's just a little bit younger than her aunt. So these three women are born in South Carolina and experienced the difficulties of being African American in the South. My mother died at a relatively young age, and so I knew my grandmother But really got to know Aunt Flossie when I moved to D.C. Spent a lot of time with her and tried to learn as much as I could about the family. But I remember when the movie The Help came out and the novel came out. So I read the novel, saw the movie, and I asked her about it. And she said, Dennis, why would I need to see that? She said, don't you know all the, and this is her phrasing, all the females in your family did domestic work for white people? That would be my mother, her, my grandmother. I knew my grandmother was a cook. Aunt Josie was a cook. Aunt Flossie was a cook. They started out as maids, and they eventually became cooks. My mother didn't do that for long. She eventually became a licensed practical nurse. But I thought about Aunt Flossie, and when she died, it was around the time I was starting working on the book. And I thought about her life and the way she testified of the Lord's presence in her life, and the way the eulogist spoke about her, in spite of all these difficulties that she had gone through. And then I had to think about it. In the 30s, doing part of the Great Migration to bring her up from South Carolina to D.C., my mother and her mother went on up to New York, which is how the Edwardses eventually come to be. But that was a traumatic time. And just to put that in context, stay with me. Some of you may have just seen the movie Just Mercy or read the book. But Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative down in Alabama, you can go to the lynching memorial. And the memorials are placed by county, each monument there. So I went looking for Lawrence County, South Carolina, which is where my mother's side of the family all came from, and saw the listing of people lynched, and then seeing the years and thinking, oh, my mother would have been such and such an age, and Josie would have been such and such, and Flossie would have been about such and such. And I couldn't help but to think, part of the movement of these folks from the South going further up, these things were not coincidental. So, thinking about that kind of life, a woman in this patriarchal society, African American, in a very racist part of the world, of the country, and how they didn't really fit. If you ever get to read another book, The Warmth of Other Suns, it talks about the Great Migration. It's an awesome book. So I couldn't help but to think about Aunt Flossie as I'm working through 1 Peter. Because part of the message of 1 Peter deals with that sense of alienation, not belonging. And now, yes, the not belonging is because of faith, but people who don't fit are the picture for us of Peter's readers who did not fit into their society, if you follow what I'm getting at. So anyway, with that in mind, I'm going to try to... Oh, I've got the clicker. I don't have to go there. I'm learning. I don't teach in big room like this, so this is good. See, it's tiny. I'm sorry. Okay, thanks. Don't make me feel better. I appreciate it. But there are some initial matters to get into when you're talking about 1 Peter. Now, Peter doesn't get nearly the attention that Paul does. So I was in a panel, not here. Any of you heard of the preacher Greg Boyd? Some of you may have heard, and he writes a lot. He's in St. Paul. So when I was in Minneapolis, he and I became friends. And I was at a panel, and he wrote this big book. And anyway, we had this big discussion, and he was arguing about something that Paul wrote and kind of putting down Peter. So I, of course, had to say it. I said, you don't rob Peter to pay Paul. And at least people appreciated that, and they laughed there too. But I was kind of serious, is that I felt like we keep doing this. We keep pushing the general epistles further to the back of the Bible. They're already in the back of the Bible. We could pay attention to the general epistles. They're part of the canon too. But it's nothing against Paul. I mean, it's great to have the Pauline studies. But the study of 1 Peter in particular has been under the shadow of Pauline studies. And I'll say it more clearly in a moment. 2 Peter is a different story, and that we won't get into 2 Peter today unless we get some questions. But the authorship of Peter has come into question. So we're going to deal with a few academic issues to start off, but then we'll try to get as practical as possible. But I do want to deal with some of this because you'll see it in the literature. Every commentary you get is going to deal with questions of authorship and all of that. But there are, in contemporary scholarship, there's some questions over whether Peter wrote 1 Peter. Some of you know that some ancient writings were written in the name of people, but not written by those people, right? So that's happened, like First Enoch or Fourth Ezra. Enoch and Ezra didn't write those books, but their names are on them. So one of the issues is that the first one is that the Greek of 1 Peter appears to be too sophisticated for an uneducated Galilean fisherman to have written it, including Peter's use of the Greek Old Testament, which he uses a lot. So that's been one of the questions, is like, this is really good Greek. This guy's a Galilean fisherman. Could he have written this? Right? Secondly, 1 Peter allegedly depends on Paul, particularly the disputed letters, which are, well, we won't get into all that, but they're dated much later than the mid-first century. So some people think if those letters are late and he depends on those letters, then Peter couldn't have written it, if you see the logic there. And then lastly, the situation of Peter's readers reflects a time later in the church's historical development when persecution was more widespread. I'm going to mention it later, but some of you may be familiar because it comes up in almost every church history class, but it's the letter from Pliny to Trajan, and it's about 112 AD, and it's his treatment of the Christians. But he's governor of Bithynia and Pontus, two of the places that are mentioned at the opening of Peter's letter. So he clearly says he doesn't know what to do with these Christians, as he writes to Trajan. And he just says, on principle, I beat a couple of the slaves, of the deacons, of women who were called deacons. He said, and just on principle. But he didn't really find anything wrong with them. They just were superstitious to him. It was just odd to him, right? I mean, we'll read some of that later. But the point is, if the persecution gets hot into the second century, if Peter's talking about that, then it couldn't have been written by Peter, right? Because he'd be dead under Nero in the 60s. So that's the criticism, right? But there can be a response. I don't want to get bogged down on academic issues, but you should be aware those are the three main issues against Peter. So I'm going to respond to them briefly, and then they can come up later. So with a lot of New Testament letters, even with Paul, one could imagine there being they don't even have to imagine. We know they were not alone. Gene Green, who used to be at Wheaton, he just moved to Florida. He wrote a book called Vox Petri, The Voice of Peter. And so he says, while the letter contains the Vox Petri, the voice of Petri, we should not expect to hear the unredacted Verba Petri. In other words, we don't have to have the exact words of Peter at every place. But he suggests that Peter was part of a community of folks. We know Silvanus was with him. We know other people were with him. It's very likely that not just Peter, but even with the case of Paul, that these letters were written with other people. Just on a side note, Scott McKnight has a book called Reading Romans Backwards, and he talks about Phoebe in there. And he argues that Phoebe's not just the carrier of the letter, but the one who is not just going to read the letter in community, but perform the letter, he would say. So when the person is there reading to the community and it talks about the strong and the weak, Phoebe can look over at the strong and at the weak. And she would have been schooled by Paul and how to read, what's going on in the letter. So if that's true, and it may very well be, then it's very likely that all our New Testament letters are written by people who are not just sitting in the dark in a cave somewhere writing by themselves, but have a community of folks with whom they reflect ideas as they're writing what God is giving them. So in other words, Peter doesn't have to just rely on his own use of Greek. As for his alleged dependence on Paul, there's just no clear evidence that he's the only other writer that uses the in Christ kind of language. So folks have thought, okay, that's what Peter does. I mean, Paul does that all the time. In him, in Christ. And Peter does say that. But there's not really a strong argument to say that Peter is borrowing all his language and phrases from Paul. I mean, you can line up the passages, and scholars have done this, lined up the passages near each other, look at the books together, and there's a commonality of Christian tradition there. But it's not to say that you can't prove that Peter depended on Paul. And regarding the historical circumstances, most scholars are seeing now that what's happening in those provinces that get mentioned at the beginning of the letter does not reflect empire-wide systemic persecution. In fact, it seems to be localized, and I'll use the word harassment, that the Christians are facing rather than the stringent kind of wiping out of their belief. It's like the people are struggling to live their daily lives with people who don't understand their way of life, if you follow what I'm getting at. Okay? So that's related to authorship. Another initial question is, who are these people? Well, it sounds like Seinfeld. Who are these people? So there's a question of what's the background of these people that are mentioned. Now, if you've got the text there in front of you, he's writing to these people and he mentions these provinces, right? Cappadocia, Bithynia, Galatia. You see all these. Oh, I got it right there. Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Right? That I did write it out. Who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ, to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. That sounds rather Jewish, rather Old Testament-y, Old Testament-ish. Right? So the question is, are his readers Jewish? Right? So when you open up with that kind of language, it sounds so much like the Old Testament, right? Especially words like chosen, destined by God, right? That sounds like Israel kind of language. So there have been scholars in the past who thought these are Jewish folks. Now that would make it interesting. It means that you've got Jews, of course, in the empire. This is now in Turkey, right? Which that wouldn't surprise us too much, but that would have been converted and became a Christian. So that's a possibility, right? And I give you these allusions to Old Testament ritual and to the notion of election. I mean, he goes on to say in chapter 1, in the service that I was in this morning, because I know we had two services. The one I was in, the preacher preached from 13 through 25, and she made reference to this section here. And you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. So stopping there for a second. Now it's a mixed message. Because on the one hand, the references to blood and lamb sound like, you can say out loud, because since it's after lunch and we're probably sleepy, we're going to need to speak up and say stuff. So yeah, somebody just said it. It's to what? Sounds like Passover, or at least Old Testament ritual, right? But particularly Passover. He just weaved that in. But the other part is he says, the feudal ways inherited from your ancestors. Would that sound very Jewish? I mean, would Peter knock the Jewish tradition? Maybe somewhat ambiguous. All right, I'm going to keep going. So he makes also references to the Old Testament that seem targeted to Jewish people. Not just an allusion now, but targeted. He says right from this famous passage of Scripture that's in what some have called the eagle's wings passage. It's when right before the law is given. It's Exodus chapter 19, and they're coming through the wilderness, right? They're coming up to Sinai, and there's this beautiful passage. The Lord said, I took you and carried you on eagle's wings. And then he says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's the Exodus reference. Now he gets Hosea. Once you were not a people, Lo Ami. You might remember he had to name one of his kids Lo Ami, not a people. But now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy. He had to name the other kid Lo Ruhama, right? Not mercy. But now you have received mercy. So he's making these allusions to the Jewish people in the Old Testament. First allusion, now straight out direct reference. So it sounds like he's looking at Jewish people, right? So now there's the other side of it, right? Is he talking to people from a pagan background? Pagan, i.e. Gentile. You know you were ransomed from the feudal ways. I just mentioned that one already. And then getting down to chapter 4, if we were to look ahead, chapter 4, when he starts to contrast their behavior with that of the society, he says, you have already spent enough time in doing what the Gentiles like to do, living in licentiousness, passions, drunkenness, revels, carousing, and lawless idolatry. They are surprised that you no longer join them in the same excess of dissipation, and so they blaspheme. Could that be said of a Jew? Unlikely. That they used to be like that and stopped being like that? Unlikely. So, here are some conclusions that I reached without taking you on the long journey. This is the shortcut. Peter's frequent references to Israel's story with God may be his way of communicating that Gentiles have been drawn into that same story. Here's the words of a scholar who wrote the Word biblical commentary on this. J. Ramsey Michaels says, the Jewish past became their past. It seems best to, this is my words, it seems best to conclude that although the Christians to whom Peter writes were predominantly Gentile in background, they were likely a mixed community of Gentiles and Jews. That seems to be more likely that they're mixed, but the Gentile identity is pretty prominent. So most scholars think they even will use the word predominantly Gentile, if you're following with me. Good so far? Clear? Okay, good. So just think about that already. We've got people who were outside the community of faith, like Paul talking to the Ephesians, right? And you were far away from the covenant, far away from the promises, but you've been brought near. There's a similar kind of thing going on, that inclusion of the Gentile into this community that's the people of God is also happening here. Peter is saying you're part of this people of God that has, with this continuity, you might say, from the Old Testament. Right? So, now, what's their situation? These are important questions when you start to think about how do I want to frame my sermons or frame my series, if I'm going to do some lessons or do a sermon series. You all know it's kind of important to kind of at least imagine what might be the historical situation of the people. And Peter uses these words to describe them. He says they are eklektos, they are chosen. Parapidemos has to do with being a stranger or an alien. Diaspora is clearly dispersion. And then parakia is like a foreigner, an exile. Do we take them literally? So that's the question. I'm not going to belabor it, but that is the question, because if it's literal, then it sounds actually more Jewish. It sounds like people who were really pushed away from the homeland, and they're into this state. They're in this geographically difficult place. But most scholars are saying, they seem to be mostly Gentiles. And it's not about geographic movement. These are figures of speech. They're metaphors by which a situation of social alienness is characterized. These people are not at home because they live out of step with the rest of the world. Aliens, strangers, right? Okay. There's a young African-American scholar, New Testament. She's at Boston University. Her name is Shively Smith. She wrote a book called Strangers to the Family. And she makes this comment about the notion of diaspora. She says, the diaspora experience does not always require a community's physical movement and resettlement. Now, when she does the study, she's looking way back at Hebrew words for exile and foreigner and all of that, and comparing to this notion in 1 Peter. And she says that bidirectional movement is absent in 1 Peter. You don't see the geographic movement, in other words. Instead of being passively moved from a specific geographic point of origin, the letter depicts the readers as actively moving toward establishment of their own social community in their own land with a global and celestial reach and kinship. In other words, this is about people forming an identity when they're out of place in society, but not because of geographic movement. Right. So, if there were some literal movement, it's certainly not what Peter is emphasizing. The metaphor of diaspora emphasizes how Peter's readers are like immigrants throughout time, socially disconnected from the dominant culture. Diaspora is a fragile social situation. So that's why I started out telling you the story of my great aunt. Because much of her life she was in a fragile social situation, but her faith sustained her. And I'm saying that that's kind of the image that I have for the audience in 1 Peter. We're going to go on and talk a little bit about diaspora. I just want to stop for a moment and make sure we're doing okay. Any questions or comment or observations so far on either the audience or the author? Because that's what we mostly talked about. Okay, we're good? All right. Thanks. Well, I'm going to give you a quote here that's coming up about diaspora. Yeah, I'm going to read it. It's powerful. I really like it. It's from Willie Jennings, not his big, massive book, Christian Imagination, but he has a commentary on Acts. And he talks about diaspora. Diaspora means scattering and fragmentation, exile and loss. It means being displaced and in search of a place that could be made home. Danger and threat surround diaspora life. Diaspora life is crowded with self-questioning and questions for God concerning the anger, hatred, and violence visited upon a people. We must never confuse voluntary migration with diaspora, because diaspora is a geographic and social world not chosen and a psychic state inescapable. The peoples who inhabit diaspora live with animus and violence filling the air they breathe. They live always on the verge of being classified enemy, always in evaluation of their productivity to the empire, always having an acceptance on loan, ready to be taken away at the first sign of sedition. They live in fear as an ever-present partner in their lives, the fear of being turned into a them, a dangerous other, those people among us. They also remember loss. Now, in this case, he is making reference to geography, of land and place, of life and hope, and even for some of faith. Yet diaspora is also power. The power of a conviction to survive and the power of a confession to never yield to the forces that would destroy them. Diaspora is life by any means necessary. The condition of diaspora is often bound up with life under empire. Faith is always caught between diaspora and empire. It is always caught between those on the one side, focused on survival and fixated on securing a future for their people, and on the other side, those intoxicated with the power and possibilities of empire and of building a world ordered by its financial, social, and political logics that claim to be the best possible way to bring stability and lasting peace. Whew. There's a lot in there, isn't it? I was going to cut it short, and I said, no, I want you to get that whole thing, because there's some things that are really powerful in there. Now you can see how folks who are displaced and out of step feel so careful around the powers. Their acceptance is on loan, he says. Now, I'll go back to Shively Smith. She said that the word diaspora, of course, back then in the first century, could have had a technical sense or a metaphorical sense. But we now use that word since, and she gives the time frame, I'm not sure when, but it's gotten into our psyche to refer to any people moved from their homeland, right? So African Americans are considered part of the diaspora. Right? We were from Africa way back, but not in recent years for many of us, right? I used to get Christianity Today when it was paper, and I might start getting it again, because my friend Daniel Harrell, I knew him back in Minnesota. He's the new editor. So I said, Daniel, okay, you're the new editor. I might start getting it again. I told him, got to pay money. But they used to have these ads, and in the ads, they were for you to find your family crest. So I was like, come on. But I think Christianity Today knew its audience, and so I could put in this name Edwards and probably find some family crest that would mean pretty much absolutely nothing to me. I don't even know how I got the name Edwards, right? This British name. I did Ancestry.com, right, a little while ago. Just on a side note. Oh, this is how I teach, by the way. Sorry. I'm telling you little stories within stories. I hope it keeps you awake. But, when you do your evaluations, you can say, that guy's weird. He tells too many stories. But I'm going to tell you this story. So I do the Ancestry.com because, what do we know? So we know that almost all African Americans who've been here for a while, we're going to be like 70-something% from West Africa. So we figured that. But I'm 12% Scandinavian. Scandinavian. And I'm ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church, which used to be the sweetest covenant. I'm like, now I'm a Calvinist. Because it's like, I was like destined to be part. I'm just kidding. Especially about that last part. But but this whole idea of marketing to people that you know are of European descent, because their assumption was the evangelicals reading this are white people from European descent. And I don't see those ads anymore, but they were there for quite a bit. But as a diaspora person, you look at that and say, I don't fit in this world. Now, that's just the displacement part. The question is, does that displacement create a threatening environment? And it does for Peter's people. Now, you hear me driving this point home. I do want to keep that as part of the issue in 1 Peter. So now, I'd like you to work together, if you can. I was hoping for 5 groups, because there's 5 chapters in 1 Peter. And like I said, you can do it or not. But I'd like you to read through the chapter that you have. It won't take you long, honestly. There's not that many verses, 20-something verses at the most. And what I'd like you to look for are what you would consider major ideas in just your chapter that your group is working on. So when I said themes or ideas, so like love or suffering, something major in there, right? And then the second, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Suffering is all 5 chapters in 1 Peter.
Well, we might discover this together. This is the beauty of teaching. No, that's okay. I could just go to my next slide where I tell you what the themes are, but I thought this would be more fun. Okay, and then secondly, but you're right. Make the drama. So how does Peter make reference to Christ? That part I would like you to see. And I say some aspect of Christ's public ministry or some aspect of Christ's passion. In other words, how does Christ fit in there? By way of example, so you don't have to do a big dissertation on it, but you know what I mean. Just say quickly, like he refers to Christ as an example, or he refers to the suffering of Christ as an example. You tracking with me? That's the second thing. And then the third thing would be, how, if at all, does Peter use the Old Testament? Now, how is a big fuzzy word, but if you were in the same service I was in this morning, the Northwestern drama team, that was awesome. We read the scripture, and they said, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God. That's an Old Testament quote that Peter is using in there. So the answer of the how there is that when he's making his point about the word, he wants to build on an Old Testament idea. Do you follow what I'm saying? So that would be my thing. I would answer that question by saying he uses this psalm. That's from Isaiah, I guess. He uses that quotation to strengthen his point about God's word or about being nurtured in God's word. So you with me? Okay, can we do this? Can we get into 5 groups without it being too difficult? So should I assign them? So let's go by geography. Chapter 1, these 3 tables here, I guess, will give you some time. Let's see. Chapter 2, first 3 rows. Would that work? Then I still got 3, 4, 5, right? So chapter 3, the last 3 rows. That's a smaller group. Chapter 4, oh man, you guys are spread out, but you could all work together. 4, and then this is 5. All right? If you want to move, you can be a diaspora person. You can move to another group if it suits you. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'll say it again if it's hard to see. You're going to look for major themes, ideas. How does Peter make reference to Christ? And then how does he use the Old Testament? Let's take 15 minutes at the most. So when I was trying to work through the commentary, I asked Scott McKnight, how did he think we should go about it? And they gave all these writer guidelines, and they said, 60% exegesis, we want 40% kind of engaging the text, so they call that living the story. If you get the book, you'll see how it's broken down. But all of them in the series are done the same way. I think we call it explaining the text, living the text. I forget how it's broken down, but he said, just work through the Greek text, and he said, do your exegesis, and then you can engage later with the major commentaries. And I said, oh, good. That's kind of the way I would do it as a pastor anyway. I want to work with the text first. And I was struck with how much Peter was using the Old Testament. I actually hadn't thought about that when I first started looking at it. But what I'd like is, if you don't mind, maybe one person to speak, and then others can just chime in, but to just report back briefly from your groups. So group chapter 1.
Somebody else took notes.
This looks like an all preacher group, and everybody got quiet. Okay, right.
It's an all preacher group.
Our major theme was hope to start it out with.
Oh, hope, good.
Yeah.
I should have chronicled these. Okay. I'll put up my email later. Okay. All right. So chapter 1, you said hope.
Yeah, that was the sort of first and primary one. And then there's certainly suffering and continuity of faith through generations and this perishing and imperishing faith in life.
I'm going to say continuing faith just as a shortcut. Okay. Hope, suffering, continuing faith. Okay. And then secondly, I asked, I'm not going to write all this part down, but how does Peter reference Christ in chapter 1?
The living hope, holy example, Redeemer.
Okay, so
Passover lamb. Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, so you're giving us the very language. I was thinking if you summarize that language, is there a picture of Christ that's coming through with his use of with his references to Christ? You sound like you said at the end of a sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's a right. So you're kind of focusing on what Christ has done in that grand sense of things. Okay, good. And then lastly, does he use the Old Testament directly or how?
Yeah, he uses Leviticus and be holy, and as well as Isaiah, all men are like grass.
Very good.
Yeah.
So notice with the sacrificial language, you've got reference back to Leviticus too. So
And
it kind of
also-
makes you wonder if he's thinking in that part of the Old Testament while he's working on this. Thank you. I'll cut that short. Chapter 2. Thanks.
Where was chapter 2? You guys? Who wants to talk? Who wants the mic?
So not the preacher group I'm seeing. Okay, right?
They are too.
Nobody wants to
Some of them might.
talk out loud. Okay.
Yeah, although
All right.
I couldn't hear much of what our group was discussing, so I don't know how I got the microphone.
Oh, gee. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything from chapter 2, though? Okay. Thematically?
So major ideas. I don't know what were the major ideas. I know the building of a spiritual house,
Okay, the spiritual house. Good. Okay.
the chosenness, I heard,
Yeah, I'm going to say election just because it's easier to spell. than
identity.
chosen. Identity. Good. Thank you. That's helpful. Anyway, go ahead. What about, is Christ in there?
References to Christ, the living stone.
Living stone, yep.
Yep, rejected and precious. Others, you guys?
Umpteen churches I know call themselves Cornerstone. This is one of the places where it's coming from, right? Yeah,
Right.
good.
Right.
And then lastly would be use of the Old Testament, and you just hit it on some of these, right? That's the royal priesthood passage, right? Is in there, chapter 2.
Correct. Right.
So I say how, that's such a vague term, but he's using the Old Testament to reinforce these concepts of their identity and their chosenness in a sense, right? I just put words in your mouth, but I think that would be the case, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. It's filled with Old Testament quotes.
It is.
It's
That one is.
amazing.
There's a lot in chapter 2.
Yeah.
There's the allusions to the whole, that whole cornerstone passage, his stuff out of Isaiah.
Right.
So that kind of makes you wonder. Just thinking from a writing standpoint, he's now pulling stuff from around the Old Testament to build up this sense of their identity. Christ is cornerstone. Cornerstone's got him thinking about this. The Word, he comes in. He starts out with some reference to the Word. He's got Isaiah. Who's got the taste and see? That's chapter 3. That's coming
was
up.
us, yeah.
So he's still like in Isaiah for a while. But anyway, thank you, chapter 2. Chapter 3.
By the way, isn't it the case too, Dennis? I read this recently that quote from Psalm 118 about the stone the builders rejected is the most oft quoted Old Testament text in the New Testament.
I did not know that, but I could believe it because
Yeah,
it was
it's all over the
sung
place.
at what we call Palm Sunday.
Chapter 3. themes we noticed. There's a kind of this relational ethic that's throughout the chapter. Husbands and wives relating to one another, how to do that well. And then relations with other Christians, be like-minded, sympathetic, love one another. So beyond just husband and wives. And then even maybe those who are persecuting you, they're watching how you respond. Be ready to be a witness. Do it humbly and well, so that
Very good. Yeah.
you put them to shame in their persecution of you.
I wrote down relationships, Christian and also with outsiders. That's the famous apologetics verse, right? To be able to
Correct.
give an answer, right?
That's
Very
right.
good. He does use the word apologia to give an argument back, right? Very good.
And we saw the Old Testament. There is Sarah and Abraham reference, I think, if I heard my friends up here correctly.
Right.
Noah, reference to Noah.
Yeah, in that complicated passage.
Yeah, and then everyone's that well-known story of Jesus preaching to the imprisoned spirits.
Come to my workshop on Peter's prickly passages, if I can put a
There you
commercial
go.
in there, because we'll talk about that.
And then some quotes of Psalm, and I think Isaiah was in there too.
Yeah, very good. Okay, did Christ show up in a sense in the same way in chapter 3? Did you see?
There was the suffering, but also resurrection and ascension as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. In that main confusing passage, but you're right. It's his crucifixion, whatever happened after, and then the resurrection. Yeah, very good. Thank you. All right, chapter 4. Chapter 4, we start to get to what we're kind of used to with Paul is the very specific kind of ethical injunctions, although they've been sprinkled throughout. Chapter 4.
Okay, some major themes. Of course, suffering is in this chapter. Patience required by the church as they suffer. Love expressed to each other. Serving each other, so service. And though the word holiness isn't mentioned, it's implied in the way that they're called to live as a unique community.
Very good.
References to Christ. Well, the suffering of Christ physically in his own body is connected to the body of the church that suffers. Christ is a model. And the church is connected to both his suffering but also his glory, his resurrection. And Christ as judge is mentioned. Use of Old Testament. There's a quote from Proverbs. But there's allusions to a variety of passages. Isaiah was mentioned, the Spirit of God resting. That's mentioned in Isaiah 11, but also resting on the church. The judgment on God's household from Jeremiah 25, and there's some other references to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, now that you said holiness, it didn't come up in chapter 1, but it could be considered a theme up in chapter 1, too, where you've got the Leviticus passage, right? Be holy, for I'm holy. Look about that. All right, chapter 5.
All right. Yeah, I took notes. Okay, so we saw an overarching theme of exhortation in time of suffering, which included keeping perspective, having humility and unity in the body, but also pastorally a theme of shepherding. That's to the elders.
All right, good. Okay, thank you. All right, and how does he make use of Christ?
We saw this eschatologically, that Christ is the chief shepherd, and he's bringing in the eternal glory in Christ.
Wow.
So
Okay.
it's sort of beyond the public ministry and passion. We saw this as like Christ in the end.
Yeah. I I like that. I hadn't really thought too much of that. I was thinking when he opens up, he says, as a witness or a fellow, he says he's a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings. And I thought about all the things that Peter also witnessed, but that's the thing he's like emphasizing here, as a witness of Christ's suffering. So I think you're right. As suffering, shepherding, Christ is a model. Christ, there's an eschatological picture. Use of the Old Testament.
So the Proverbs verse sticks out as a direct quotation, but the other images are Jesus as the shepherd, God's mighty hand, like walking through the picture of the whole Old Testament.
Yeah.
And we wondered about this Satan prowling like a mighty
Yeah, like a roaring
lion,
lion, right.
Maybe referring to Cain or...
Oh, this is interesting. I hadn't seen that when I worked through it, but I don't know where he's getting that predatorial image from, but he does. But it's consistent with other writing, even like James, the idea that the devil is after you and you can resist the devil, that kind of thing. So, okay, there may be an Old Testament allusion there I didn't catch, but all right. Thank you all. I appreciate you doing the work. I wanted you to see that even in a quick reading, there are some things that are going to stand out to us. We already came prepared for the suffering notion. I think we kind of knew already that was there. There's this real sense of the community's identity that emerges, and I think that's where I mentioned her earlier, Shively Smith. I think she's right in that part of when you're an alien and stranger, part of what strengthens you is to realize you are part of a community, a fellow citizens, and you get a sense of identity and solidarity in there, even in your being alienated. Well, there's a few things I'll just emphasize that I had worked on. That I think you guys got most of it there. I did say that exile, I think, is a big theme. That's an overarching one for the whole letter. Now, that touches on things like we were talking about, this sense of idea and of identity and being at a distance, that whole diaspora thing I was talking about. So he says in chapter 2, as aliens and strangers, or some translations as foreigners, aliens, this idea of being exile, that God's people live under pressure within this unbelieving world. So who knows best? So now if you're preaching about it, you want to illustrate it. Part of your illustration is going back to ancient Rome. That's why I took the Trajan Pliny conversation and used that in my own preaching of this. But I also tried to look at people from the world that I knew. And part of that is, like I mentioned, my Aunt Flossie, my great Aunt Flossie. So I asked you to consider some folks who would know what it's like to be alienated. Now, in some sense, I'll just go with this. So first I mentioned Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. If you're familiar, you would know he wrote that in 1949. So it's been 70 years. Last year was 70th anniversary. It's a small book. Howard Thurman's theologian, mystic, poet, visited Gandhi, big influence on Martin Luther King, and notion of passive resistance. So he wrote this book, and he says in the beginning, he's trying to explore what religion, he says the word religion, but then he goes on to explain Christianity, has to do with, for those whose, as he puts it, whose backs are against the wall. What does the faith have to offer folks who are alienated? So I think of him and that book as a good complement to this letter. I also said the experience of immigrants and ethnic minorities, people whose lives reflect this sense of diaspora, distance from the majority culture. The experiences of women. Then I go on to think more about that. The experiences of children, the physically challenged, the economically challenged, the less formally educated. You can go on and think about those folks that society tends to overlook. Their situations mirror, I'm not saying that Peter was writing specifically to all those groups. What I am saying is that he's writing to people whose lives are mirrored in these folks' lives. So I would think, preaching through 1 Peter, those are good places for us to look when we're trying to illustrate what does it mean. It's not just I'm going to get myself in trouble if I say something too political, but it's not just whether I say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays and then somebody looks at me funny for saying Merry Christmas. It's about my actual being not being welcome in this place. That's a hard life. And then so imagine it. Imagine it for that first century Gentile whose way of life, whether it's in the baths, whether it's in the marketplace, wherever they're doing business, is now radically different because they've encountered Christ. They're part of this Christian community. So now all these connections they had socially, economically, business, they start to dry up. They don't have those levels of relationships that they had before. That's even tougher than the person, in some cases, who never tasted it. Right? Here's the folks who tasted some of it. But, of course, it brought with it this kind of wild lifestyle, too. They drew back from all of that, and now they don't. And not only are they not welcome there, they get talked about. They get slandered, is the language that Peter uses. All right, but anyway, I just wanted you to connect and think about people whose situations may mirror that. Now, I put text there, but you already read the text, so I won't. You won't have to read that. But I've said in 1 Peter, the best examples of living for Jesus in hostile territory are slaves and women. Now, when I say best examples, is that he goes right to them. Now, he does what Paul does. They call these the household codes. He goes after the people the way typical Greco-Roman household was structured. Husbands, wives, children, slaves. That's how Greco-Roman house was ordered, particularly, Aristotle writes about this. But here, so you see it in Paul, right? At the end of Colossians, end of Ephesians, husband, wives, parents, children, masters, slaves are addressed. Similar happens here, except Peter's a little bit different. He doesn't address the children. And he addresses slaves, although he uses a different term for slaves. He uses household slave, household servant, oikotas. But he says, when he says these tough words, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. It's a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. Unjustly. At least he calls it unjust. Right. But then his example, he says, when you do this, verse 21, and that's why you guys were at chapter 2, you saw this Christ as the model. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example. He's pretty explicit here. Christ is the example of what it means to suffer unjustly. He doesn't say it's going to change, because he doesn't know. These first century writers, they don't know if society is going to change. He says, be like Christ. This was the hardest chapter for me to write on, because a lot of people I know, including my own family, really cringe at this. Accept the authority of your masters, not just the good ones. I've been talking with some folks. I was presenting on this at another seminary, and one of the students there caught what I was trying to say, and then he is a young white guy, but he responded back in a way that I could tell he was tracking. He said, "Oh, it's like driving while black." And I said, "You get it." I said, because what you do when you're alien and stranger and you're in a situation that you think is unjust and may actually be unjust is you do everything possible to show that you are not to be, that you don't need to be scrutinized anymore. So it's what we teach our young guys, to keep your hands on the wheel. We're not saying that the system shouldn't be reformed, but what we're saying is in the here and now, at this moment, you might get a scrutiny that you don't deserve, but do everything you possibly can to not bring anything extra on yourself. And in a sense, that's what Peter is saying. Don't do anything to bring any extra judgment on yourself. So it's not an endorsement of evil. He straight out calls it unjust. But he's really just given a plan for survival. This is how you're going to keep from getting killed. We would like more. I would like more. I don't think our New Testament always gives us more from the first century. But what he says now is, Jesus is your model. And he gives a quick summary. By the way, this quick summary, he committed no sin, no deceit found in his mouth, quoting the Old Testament, right? When he was abused, he didn't return abuse. He goes on to say he bore our sins on his body so that we might live for righteousness. You were like sheep going astray. You've come back. He gives like this quick, almost gospel discussion here. And in some ways, it functions like, if you're familiar with Philippians chapter 2, with this very exalted picture of Christ in that hymn of being equal with God, but didn't use his position, to exploit for any personal gain, but emptied himself. In some ways, Peter's doing the same thing here. It's saying that's the ethic that has to guide you, is the way Christ did. What that says for me is when I think about the legacy of slavery, I couldn't just ignore that in writing on this. But I stopped and I said, well, now what it's saying to me is that slaves who endured and kept the faith are not to be objects of pity. They now become models. So what has happened is that I've tried to elevate the status of people that we might typically pity to say they become the best examples for me of what it means to be like Christ. Now, in our society, and I guess I get a little preachy in these things, but in our society, we often think the best examples of people who are like Christ are the people who's got the biggest churches, get close to power, they can influence politicians and all that. Now, I say we in this big sense of American Christianity, not you folks in this room, but I'm just saying, often our picture of who the most stellar Christian is the person who's most successful in the eyes of the world. They keep getting the attention. And what I'm trying to say is our examples are elsewhere. Our examples should be these slaves. And slaves who kept the faith in the midst of injustice. That, to me, is a pretty significant theme that I want to push out a bit. And now, if we think about it from a little historical perspective, and I don't know if I want to press this too much, but I think of Peter understanding that even better than Paul, not to pit them against each other, but this is my response back to Greg, Greg Boyd, is that Peter's functionally not a citizen. He's a Jewish man under the Roman occupation. Paul is a citizen. One scholar of classics, Mary Beard, B-E-A-R-D, she wrote a book called SPQR on Roman history. And she's not a fan of the Christians, but she can be like a little smart alecky talking about Christians, but she does get the history right. And she says, one difference is Paul being beheaded and Peter being crucified upside down. And I said to myself reading that, I said, oh, so a benefit of citizenship is a quick death as opposed to a slow. But that was her point, though, is that he had a quick execution as opposed to a horrible, long, drawn-out one, as a citizenship brought its rights and privileges even in his execution. But the point is, Peter understands what it's like not to be a citizen. He knows what it's like to be on the outside. And the slaves represent Christ in a way that others don't, if you're following with me. I want to go on and say something similar for women. We have in this passage, and we could talk about it in the other workshop in more detail, because it is a prickly passage for some people. But the women become examples for us here too, of great faith. And it says, because they are able to witness, verse 1, they may win their husbands over. These would be non-believing husbands. So historically, most likely these women are believers. Well, they're clearly believers. They're most likely married to men who are not. But the difficulty is that the man set the religious identity for the household. So because of that hierarchy I told you before, right, in the Greco-Roman household. So the male is setting the religious identity for the household. So you've got these converted wives whose husbands are not Christian, so they're in a very difficult situation. And Peter says they might be won over without a word. Without a word. So I say at the end, women in patriarchal society represent Jesus by demonstrating the power of a wordless witness. I said evangelicals can be wordy people, and women who have been near the bottom of society for most of history can demonstrate the power of a wordless witness. So again, I want to elevate the status of the women here. It's not about how they dress per se. It's not about how women should just be quiet. Even that word that's used here for quiet is just simply another word for humility that Peter uses. And he uses Sarah as an example, who showed deference to her husband. No commentary on the legitimacy of patriarchy, but he uses her as an example to say this is a woman of faith, and even in her tough situation, she's an example of faith for us. So what I'm trying to do is elevate the status here to say women who are living the faith in an oppressive way, they show us even better what it means to witness for Jesus, just like the slaves. So I've taken people who are already on the margins, slaves and women, and I'm trying to make a case that they represent for us. They become models for us, not just objects of pity, actually objects to be emulated, who learn how to witness without words, who learn how to live the faith under oppression. All right. I'm going to keep going a little bit, then we'll do some things together. Well, we'll have time. So we already mentioned suffering was a theme. I won't repeat that. Election, the idea of God's chosenness. Holiness is a theme. I also want to push out this notion of community. Some of you caught that in there, that in these relationships and sense of community, there's a family identity that's being built in this letter. I would want to see us, when we're preaching about it and talking about it, to emphasize that. I did a preaching series at my own church before I became a full-time prof. I was teaching, adjunct for a lot of years. But I decided to preach through 1 Peter, and I wasn't even going to do it, but my staff said, Pastor Dennis, you wrote the book. We should, do it. And I said, okay, but after a while, I felt like I had, way more to say. And I said, but we did a sermon series, and I forget how, I think my overarching title was something about being the true house of God. See, it was simultaneous to us actually doing a building. We never had our own building. We were always in schools. So we actually bought a plot of land in the city, which is very unusual and hard to do, and we converted over this warehouse and made this really pretty actually cool urban space in Minneapolis. So I continually was preaching that the church is the people, not the building. This building's a tool. It's a resource. This is our community resource, meaning our neighborhood, not just the church community. So I called it being the true house of God or something like that. I can't remember exactly the title. But I took that from chapter 2, the idea of being the living stones in the house of God. And the whole idea was to strengthen our sense of community, even if we are alien to the rest of the world. But that community part comes in. I think I'm getting close to the end here. Yeah, I want to put it together. So I want us to try this we don't have to go in groups. We can just do this together. But I want us to think about these themes: exile, election, suffering, holiness, community, other things that we've seen and talked about. But I want us to prep a passage and think about how we might want to structure that for preaching. You got a lot of preachers in here, so this could be hard. So I picked one. I picked 4, 7 through 11. So let's look at that. I didn't put it up on the. I don't have the text up on the screen, so you'll have to look at it. So we'll do that together. Then I'll take questions and we'll start to wrap up. All right, so could I get a reader? Somebody read out loud? Now, just on a side note, you get a story in a story. So I grew up in this little holiness church, little storefront church in New York. I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up attending that church. I grew up in a house. But anyway, I attended this church when I was a kid. And we would get guest speakers from time to time, but there's sometimes an old tradition in African American church where the pastor calls on somebody to read the passage, and as they read, they stop them along the way and then make commentary. So they'll say, "Read," and the person will start reading, and they'll stop them, and they'll start to do some exposition and talk about it. Then read, and then the person will read some more. So when I've taught in my classes, I've asked my students have they ever experienced that. And some of those who come from a more traditional African American context have experienced that. But it is good to have other people read the scripture sometimes. That was my way of giving you some time. So who's ready? 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11. Okay, thanks.
The end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, so we'll come back to our preaching series title. I skipped that part. We'll come back to that. Let's work on this passage. So what we already talked about the big themes in the whole letter. When he says the end of all things is near, what's he saying? Christ is coming. So when you hear all things, you mean all things. What else might be possible? The suffering will be over, right? The end of this is coming. Right? Those are both possibilities. I tend to lean toward the first one, the all things. I think he's talking about the end. So we've got here this eschatological picture, right? So I feel like I'm gonna bias you by telling you what I call the sermon, but I called this. The title I gave this message was Living Like There's No Tomorrow. Because what I saw coming up, you tell me what's happening next. What does he say? That the end of all things is near, so be what? Alert is word synonyms to that, depending on your translation. Vigilant, sober, what other kind of words? Watchful. So the idea is so that you can what? Pray. So we're seeing things like that coming out. So he says time is wrapping up, but he says time is wrapping up, so pray. And he doesn't just say pray, he says get your mind together so that you can pray. Right? So there's this attitude framing that's happening here. I'm trying to decide how. No, I'll ask you questions. Then I'll tell you what I did with it. So, okay. So what else is happening? So you got this attitude frame so that you can pray. What else is happening after the prayer? He says what? Love. So now we're getting at the other theme we talked about. Another theme we talked about, right? It's the community relation thing, right? And he has already said this in chapter 2 and chapter 1. This came up in the sermon I was in this morning. Love each other deeply from the heart. He says it again here. Almost the same exact words, to love each other deeply, or some word to that effect, deeply. So, and what else? After love, what does he say? He says, above all, love each other deeply. And go ahead. Practice hospitality. What else? Use your gifts. And then he breaks down the gifts, right? He says if it's serving, you serve with the strength God provides. If it's speaking, you speak as if it's the very words of God, something like that, right? So I'm going to tell you what I did with the sermon. You can help me, or we can critique it. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It looks like there's this doxology.
And then there's this blessing.
It's not done yet. It's like
And
another whole chapter.
you're right. And he just,
This doxology in the middle of the...
amen. He breaks into this blessing that I think is kind of rich. That's actually verse 11, right? Yeah. So that's nice. So.
But he's still got another whole chapter to write. So what's he doing with the doxology before the doxology?
Yeah, well, sometimes there's this, and Paul does this sometimes too, to stop and offer a word of praise before they wrap up, which I think is kind of powerful. So I called it living like there's no tomorrow, was what I called it. And so I thought about, when I used to play football, and thought about how when there's the 2-minute drill, right? Everybody tries real hard to either score. This is if you understand American football. You try to score or you try to prevent it, right? So it always seems like there's this extra effort when the 2-minute whistle blows. I remember we were watching, a friend of mine and I were watching, and this years ago, and he said, why don't they always play like there's 2 minutes left? Now, this is before the no-huddle offense and stuff like that, but that was a good line for me, and I'll never forget it. Why don't you always play like there's 2 minutes left? And I think one of the things about New Testament ethics is that when we know the end is near, it's not like you all of a sudden shift and go into a 2-minute offense. You do the very things that you're supposed to have been doing all along. You get back to the basics, as it were. So what I said was, living like there's no tomorrow means you don't shift to a 2-minute drill. You stick with what you know, and those two things that you know are horizontal and vertical. I just did that wrong. Horizontal and vertical. Right? And he starts off with the vertical dimension first, right? He says, clear your head. So when people are struggling, all kinds of problems are sitting right in your view, right there. And he says, no, get sober-minded, vigilant. The way I phrase it is eliminate the distractions so that you can pray. He doesn't even just say pray. He says, get that frame of mind so that you can pray. To me, that's a very 21st century message. I have no idea what was distracting first century Christians the way we're distracted. We're distracted by our luxuries, right? The clickers and the visuals and the computers in our pockets and all kinds of stuff. And he says, clear your mind so that you can pray. So he wants to strengthen this vertical dimension of their life, the prayer. And then he gets at the horizontal. So I had a professor, the late Grant Osborne, who said, when we were talking about 1 Peter, this is so many years ago, he said, Christians live on the hypotenuse. And I loved it because I told you, I have an engineering degree. I was teaching math and stuff. And I said, I love that, the hypotenuse. That's the part that connects the horizontal and the vertical, right? This is a permanent. Shouldn't be there. Okay, so in a right triangle, right, that's the hypotenuse. And he said, Christians live on the hypotenuse. And that always stuck with me. So nowadays we talk about a cruciform life, right? One that's shaped like a cross, up and out, which I like that image actually. But the hypotenuse says there's this kind of balance between the vertical and the horizontal. You live in a way that balances out a relationship with God and a relationship with other people. We don't cloister ourselves away just to pray, and we don't just engage in acts, social acts, without the prayer. So the living like there's no tomorrow means we strengthen the vertical by eliminating distractions so we can pray, and then we learn how to love each other deeply, which involves serving in those ways. So for me, that turned into a nice kind of tight message that I was able to bring together some of the themes of suffering. End is coming near. Time will wrap up. It'll be different. But we'll also kind of strengthen how we strengthen our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. So that was my example I just want to give you. So before we wrap up, we got till 3-something. So before we wrap up, let's play with some ideas for a title of our whole series on 1 Peter. We've heard about themes from all 5 chapters. And then I'll take any questions. So can we play with this a little bit? Okay. So what shall we call our 1 Peter series? And then you guys who are all these experts on worship, you'll know how to bring all the other resources into it. But any thoughts?
Why can't you just call it Living on the Hypotenuse?
Oh, that'll be a real attractive one for you. Yeah, and everybody was scratching their head like, what's up with this church? Well, that's a possibility. I'm not going to throw out any ideas, okay? Sometimes the crazy. Okay, well, I don't know your context well enough. That might go. I have spoken down in Champaign-Urbana, where the U of I is, and they have this big engineering program. So I was down there one time and had a whole bunch, for InterVarsity, a whole bunch of students there. A bunch of them were engineers. And so I put something up on the screen that... So I ate some pie, and then the line underneath I said, and it was good. So the nerds got it, because 2 to the third power is 8, yeah, some. Yeah. So I ate some pie. So the nerds got it. So if you called it the hypotenuse thing, the nerds will get it, but I'm not sure if everybody will get it. But that's one. We're not going to throw it out. But seriously, what might capture the idea and kind of connect it to our times? These I know titles are idiosyncratic, but I just want us to have some fun trying to put together some themes and such. Any other ideas? Living in tension. Yeah, that's good. That's good. What did you say? In the arena. Explain that a little bit.
Well, I was thinking you're football analogy, but if you're playing like the last 2 minutes, or you're living in the arena, you got the outside challenge, but also the gladiators who stick together.
Ooh. That sounds good. There's tension, the arena. Oh, okay. These are good ideas. I wish I should have known y'all people before. Yes. Oh, you just took Stanley Hauerwas's book. That's the title of his book, Yeah, and it's on, and he makes plenty of allusions to 1 Peter. The book is called Resident Aliens, but that's by Stanley Hauerwas. That's not a bad title, though. I mean, when you do that, though, you just put it in quotation marks because it's someone's actual title, right? Resident Aliens, yes. Some others?
Do you know who you are?
Do you know who you are? So now when you have a title like that, you're thinking in terms of the identity of the believers. Do you know who you are? I like questions, too.
The chosen people, the ones
Yeah, I like that.
And then do others know? Do you know who you are, and do others know who you are?
The others.
You go on, like if you're foreigners and exiles in the world.
Yes.
You're in this world, but not of it. So, yeah.
That's right.
I heard you say it. You like questions.
I do, and that was intriguing. I try not to do it too much when I made titles of sermons, but I tend to like questions. But that last part that you just said, even though it's a cliche, there's something to that. In it, but not of it, right? You say you're in the world, but not of the world. There's something in there too that I think captures some of the spirit of 1 Peter. Anybody else? I used to fish in Galilee. Now that's interesting because there you're going to focus right on Peter. Just you prompted something else. The critics who said that they're not sure Peter wrote it. No, I'm just picking up on that, Joe. Even though that was a little funny, there's something there because some who have criticized said there's not enough clear indication of Peter's connection to Jesus. And I thought, how could anybody read this and not see that? And the picture that's really beautiful to me is at the end there in chapter 5, right? When he says to clothe yourselves with humility, right? And so this was rich. So some of you might know this already, but Peter's got a few rare words in his book that don't occur anywhere else in Greek, which is why some people have said his Greek is very sophisticated. It's not really simple like the Gospel of John. But he uses a word that's a noun for a slave garment, and he turns it into a verb. So it's like taking the word apron and making it a verb, right? So he says, apron yourself with humility. But do you see what he just did? A slave garment that you wrap around yourself. It's hard not to think about that night when Jesus took a towel, wrapped it around himself, and washed the disciples' feet. And Peter was the one who had a hard time with it, right? You want to wash my feet? And here he is saying, all of you, wrap yourselves with humility, which I think is just a powerful image there for the whole Christian community today as well as back then. Clothe yourselves with humility. So yes, well, thank you. That was good. I mean, we can play with it, have some fun with it, but I think good titles, of course, like I said, they're idiosyncratic. They're with your context, your world, what's happening in the media. I mean, all those things are important. But if you can do it in a way that kind of captures some of these themes, and maybe you get a chance to sort of spell it out a little bit, like what your series is going to do or what the lessons are going to do, you can touch on some of these themes. But I definitely see Peter in this book as well as, yes, his voice, but we can see the Peter we know from the Gospels in here as well. Well, let's see. We've got plenty of time, but I'd like to see if there's any questions or comments or observations. And we'll have a mic for you. And if there's anything you want to bring up and something we didn't touch on.
So I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one goes to the very beginning when you were asking about context, and I wanted to ask, but I was afraid, so I didn't.
Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
So as you were asking about, and it kind of goes with your Ramsey Michaels quotes, the Jewish past becomes their present. As you're looking or trying to figure out who the context was, could it have been almost like a Titus situation where you have, and we could take the Michaels quote and turn it more into Gentile living became a Jewish reality. So as with Titus, you have these Jews who are living a heathen way. Could it have been kind of that same kind of understanding that they might have been Jewish, who were people who clearly throughout the Old Testament had a hard time living into their own Jewishness and not taking on the life of outside sources?
I do hear you. I mean, I guess it's certainly possible. I mean, without knowing for 100% sure. So what I'm hearing you say is that could these have been, like, because they're diaspora Jews, could they have been, so Hellenized that they're living inconsistent with their own Jewish way? That's possible. It's hard to make argument from silence that then you would hope Peter would be calling them back to something, because you would get that in other places, even calling them back to a way of life. I don't know if it's a back to as much as it's different, a contrasting way of life. But that's just my own quick answer to that. As I was wrestling with it, I first said, man, all these Jewish references, these people got to be Jewish. And then I started going on some more, and I thought, would it, even under Hellenism, you still had faithful Jews who were living, and that line about the empty way of your ancestors, that would be hard for me to grasp as a Jewish commentary. But it's worth digging into. I mean, I don't want to. I'm not saying I got the final word on it, but I came to a conclusion that I felt like a mixed crowd is possible. But I started to see the Gentile way of being as more consistent with the audience's life before Christ. So, but yeah.
The other question I had to do with the slavery. Paul also speaks of slavery, but his is vastly different. Paul almost has a missionary mind. Submit because they may hear the gospel and become a Christian. I was wondering if that's to think of that as someone who was a citizen. He's clearly going to see slavery in a different light. It's not going to be that harsh. It's going to be, hey, we're if you're a slave in my house, we're good to you. We're kind to you. This is a good job for you. As opposed to Peter's coming from a different saying, no, this is not a good place to be.
That's possible, and there's some scholars who've written on that much more frankly, with what you're saying, is that, and some of them actually don't like that Paul then appropriated slave for himself, slave of Christ. Like, oh, come on, man, you don't know what it means to be a slave. You know what I mean? That gets a little maybe too hypercritical, but I see your point. But he does say, even in this text, he says that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So I think that would apply to the slaves too, that there is a mission aspect to it. But I do think you're right. I think there's a difference in how Paul doesn't seem to be as worked up. I mean, if we didn't have Philemon, we would be really disappointed because he doesn't seem at times to be as worked up about slavery as Peter is. Yes?
Just a comment on obedience. It made me think when you were mentioning it of my parents who lived 5 years in Nazi-occupied Europe. And they would talk about obedience to soldiers and so forth because you had to protect yourself and your neighbors. And how even and the idea of circumventing things in order to stay obedient, to keep safe.
Yeah.
And like my father's profession of faith articles all signed under a false name by a minister who was also using a false name. Both in hiding.
Wow.
And the other thing that Peter it struck me of is which made me think of living in shadows.
Ooh, here's our title.
That was the title I was thinking of. Because we often live in the shadows of all sorts of kinds. I think of Psalm 23, of course, but we live in a world of shadows. And how do you live a life as a Christian in a world of shadows?
Yeah, wow.
In a world where you really don't fit and you really don't belong. And you're like our Canadian context, you're not even always welcome. You don't really have a voice anymore. And how do you make that work in the shadows?
Yeah, man, I really like that. That's very colorful. Sharing that about your family, too. When you just his safety, but the safety of others. I think that's Howard Thurman. So I'm telling you, he wrote in 1949. It wasn't long after World War II, and he reflects even on the Holocaust of the Shoah. There's this sense of not, you're not just protecting yourself, but my people, too. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Wow.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned, you referenced chapter 3, verse 15, how that's used in apologetics. Yeah. And I was wondering, given the context you've talked about, could you say more in terms of how we should approach that? If that's a fair question.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's the verse about being prepared to give an answer for the hope that's in you with respect, with reverence, fear, how we translate that. Some think that's a courtroom statement, right? So, because apologia can have a technical sense that when you're standing before the magistrate, you have to make a defense. But not necessarily. It could be any time that you have to respond to the folks. I think, I'm not sure all that you might be thinking in your question, but I feel like the apologetic part about this is that we are, as Christian believers, to be living a certain way, right, we said, but you also need to be prepared to explain why you're living this certain way, especially in hostile territory. To me, that's the marriage of our evangelism and action. You know, we have to be prepared to respond. So I think, but the way Peter phrases it is that you're given a reason for hope that's in you. It's not just an apologetic why I'm behaving and avoiding these activities, but it's that I have this hope that we talked about as one of the themes also in the letter. So I guess what I'm trying to say in response is that it's not necessarily a technical thing, it's not necessarily a courtroom, but it's in the engaging with your neighbors who don't believe, but have you under scrutiny. And Peter is saying this: you got to be ready to respond. So is that kind of what you're getting at with your question, or were you thinking something else?
Just an acknowledgement that sometimes it's been interpreted that I think better than you, that's not a Christian.
Oh.
As opposed to this exhortation really to look to a different model, to be humble.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. I would agree with that. Thank you.
In our preaching, do you see any benefit in raising this question of Peter's authorship?
No. I consider those background matters for the preacher.
So you either preach from a perspective that this is Peter.
Yep.
Or you kind of avoid it?
Well, I wanted to just be able to be super confident in my own mind. I mean, part of that was for writing the commentary, but when I did the preaching series, I didn't even bring it up. I used Peter, the Peter they knew from the Gospels, with that assumption in mind, that that's the Peter we're talking about and the one who wrote it. But I would say, as preachers, I think when you're prepping, it's good to be aware at least of what some of those scholarly issues are, because you will find that one smarty pants in the congregation. I shouldn't say it so cynically, but you'll find that person who'll come up to you later and say, well, I was reading something that said that Peter didn't even write 1 Peter. And I think, oh, good, you can respond to them that way. But if you do come to a conclusion where you think it's pseudepigraphal and he didn't write it, it's canonical, so there's still the authority of this text, right? So, but I preached it like, yes, that's the Peter that we know from Galilee. So, yeah, and I just, yeah. Is that kind of what your question's getting at?
That's exactly it, yeah.
Okay.
I know one of the sermon I heard this morning, she slipped it in parenthetically, and I guess she knew her audience enough to think.
Oh, we might have been in a different way. I'll hear that one tonight then, okay.
Yeah,
all right.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes, there was a hand over here, I think. Okay, thanks.
Yes, if you've got a question, just wave madly. There was a woman this morning who had a question from the get-go, and I didn't see her for 40 minutes. I never saw her.
Oh.
I just wanted to know what the importance was with distinguishing between the Jews and the Gentiles. I know they have different cultural backgrounds, but I know that the Gentiles are grafted in as sons and daughters of Abraham after Christ. So I just want to know, what makes it an important distinguishment when preaching?
Great question. I'm not sure while preaching it will matter that much, except when you make reference, like when you get to chapter 4 and it's talking about the wild orgies and drinking parties and this kind of behavior. you can illustrate that as characteristic of pagan Gentile behavior. As far as Peter's audience, it might not be that significant to say these were Jews living in this or these were Gentiles living like this. But I do think for rhetorical purposes, for preaching purposes, if they really are Gentiles, then it strengthens strengthens the conversion part of the story, right? I used to hang with these people. I used to do just what they did, and now I don't anymore. That is rhetorically very strong. If I'm a Jew who didn't do those things, my conversion might not feel the same. You know what I mean? So I think from a preaching standpoint, it strengthens that rhetorical part about conversion. But I think for some scholars, it's just a historical thing they just want to get right. But I do think from preaching, it's that part. You know. Thanks. That's a good question. Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Kind of piggyback on that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that Peter draws attention to the fact that there's maybe a cross-cultural churches. But if we're working in a cross-cultural context, our congregation, our church, whatever, where you have people of different cultures working together, is there things in 1 Peter that help kind of get at what does that mean to come from very different worldviews, experiences, whatever, and still live out this call together? Is that in Peter?
Yeah. You know, I don't see it as explicitly as, say, like Ephesians 2, you know, the Jew and or Galatians 3. I don't see it as explicitly. But I did make those points when I was preaching it from chapter 2 particularly, because this house with these stones that are coming together with Christ as the cornerstone, I made the point that we're coming from all these different places, but we form this one house, you know, this one temple of God. So I made application to it, but I don't think Peter's explicitly talking about the unity of disparate groups, you know, coming together. I don't see that as strong a theme, but I just implement it in the preaching, though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sort of piggybacking on that, if we preach in a multicultural church, if we're white and we are preaching to people who are descendants of slavery, and we're preaching on slavery, especially when it's not directly called on to abolish it, what advice do you give to us specifically as white people preaching?
Yeah, you're asking me the $1 million question there. I thought, and I started thinking, well, maybe that's why the editors asked me to write this commentary, because I was thinking they didn't want to touch it. You know, so, you know, I'm going to give an answer, but I'm going to preface my answer by saying I have. You guys don't know me, so you don't know my journey, but I have tried to not tell white people what they should do about these things. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it's just been really hard for me to do that, and the pushback I've gotten over my life. I will say this, though. If there's ways that you can share those moments with people of color, that will go a long way. I mean, if there's a way that even if it's your turn to preach, but you have somebody in the congregation who's got a story, a person of color, an immigrant, somebody, if you can get them on the platform and tell their story, it would be so much more powerful to do that than to speak for them. So that's my 2 cents, really. So get in here. I mean, it's, yeah. I struggle with that chapter too, and I still look back at what I wrote and I say I like what I wrote, but I still struggle with how do I mean, my own kids, you know, they like, come on, Dad, you know, he's saying he's not upturning the system, you know, and I'm like, because we're 21st century people, we want to fight the powers, you know, and I said, you got to keep in mind, they have no power, they had nothing to fight the powers. You can't fight Rome, you know, at least they couldn't fight Rome. So I don't know how to do that exactly, but I would try to share that voice. So, thank you. Wow. Well,
I've got just one. Yes, this isn't a question, but something for you to react to, and it's a little bit. It's contained in the summary in the program book, in the head of the worship part. But you know, when you think back, so just this kind of goes back to, was this Peter really Peter? And I think it was. But you know, when you think back to Peter's life and you think of the Gospels. probably the most striking moment in Peter's discipleship was when Jesus had to kind of wheel on him and call him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. And why did Jesus have to say that? Because he objected to the idea that suffering would be part of the Messiah equation. And now here he is seeing it as part of the discipleship equation. I mean, has there been a lot of discussion about
good.
that?
I wish I had that in the book. That's good. I like that. No, I mean, I thought about it, him being a witness of Christ's suffering when I got to chapter 5, but I didn't think about his resistance to the Messiah's suffering. And here in chapter 5, he's embracing that as a model for everybody. That's pretty good. I like that. That's one of those, that's probably another evidence of the real Peter being behind this, is for him to even bring that theme in. Wow. That's good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, second edition, yeah.
It's in the next workshop.
Any other questions from anybody? Didn't miss anybody this time, I hope. Okay. Well, let's thank Dr. Edwards for his insights.